Good morning, everyone. My name is Kyle. I'm one of the pastors here. Thanks for being with us. It's amazing seeing just week after week the Lord just pack out this room. I know for a lot of you guys, it's a pretty big week coming up if you got kids in school, because this coming Wednesday is like the first day of school for 2 counties that our church has, people that, we got Pasco County, we got Hillsborough County. We've also got people getting in their last final summer vacation before, the official fall starts. So I know we just had some family fly in town 2 days ago, and they said it was the craziest, busiest airport they've ever experienced in their life. It's like everyone's just packing it in. So thank you so much for being here today. There's a lot of other places that you could be, but thank you for being faithful to the Lord and gathering together. This past few weeks has been kind of crazy for my family and I, and for the church. We've had so much just illness going through the house, and as soon as it leaves one kid, it just finds its way back around. It's just a vicious cycle. But 2 weeks ago, Creekside Church receives a phone call. And this was like a friend of the church, no one that goes here, but they just had no one else to call. This man had unexpectedly lost his wife. And he had no church of his own. He knew no other pastors, but he remembered he had a friend who was a Christian that went to church somewhere. And that's how they found us. She was 33, and she left behind 2 little girls. And so I met with the entire family for an hour and a half, 2 hours to both try to offer some comfort and then try to help them walk through grief and to embrace grief as part of the process. But then also, since it was tragic, it was unexpected, they were just reeling in pain. They were not prepared at all. And so it was one of those situations where they needed the church to completely do everything as far as putting on some sort of memorial service to remember her, to help others grieve, to celebrate her life. And so part of my meeting with them was to simply ask as much as I could about her. I'd never met her in my life before, didn't know her, but I'm asking all kinds of questions so that I can commemorate her from the stage to the group of people that would be gathering in just a day or so. Asking what kind of wife was she? What kind of mother was she? What did people love about her? To her parents in the room, what do you remember from her childhood? What kind of daughter was she? And by the end of writing a message and then delivering the message at the funeral, I felt like in a strange way I kind of knew her, even though I'd never met her, but just because of what was essentially passed on to me about her. And so the funeral happened, and then the family decided to have like lunch together on the porch. It was near the end of the lunch, and I just give the husband one last hug goodbye and let him know that like anything you need, you should just let us know. And then I get in my car and it hit me. Those types of funerals do hit close to home when you've got young kids at home as well. But I thought, what would people say about me at my funeral? If they were in a similar situation, they didn't know me, but they were just passed on information about who I was, what I stood for, what I was known for. And there's a funny thing about funerals. They make you think about things that are really important, things that are a little bit more eternal as far as impact goes, things that are, all of a sudden you don't care as much about the bank account. You don't care as much about the job promotion. You don't care as much about what the neighbors think about what color you just painted your house. These are the things that matter, that you start mulling over in your brain. And it's also interesting, as a church, we try to study through books of the Bible together, and we try our best to do those books verse by verse is the way we teach and present. We have a teaching team of 3 pastors that are up here. We do things a little bit differently than a lot of other churches out there. We just want to be faithful to Scripture, but we also like to keep everything fresh as far as our delivery, our preparation for sermons, and then try to protect ourselves from having, a single celebrity pastor in the pulpit, just things that we try to bring all the honor to the Lord in a way. And sometimes the Lord brings a situation in where you make a plan, but then he says, no, I've got a slight deviation of that plan. It's going to be better. And so I was originally supposed to preach this message a little while ago, and Pastor Jake, in our sermon plan structure that we kind of mapped out, he was going to preach a couple of chapters in one sermon because it was a lot of just information, but not a lot of preaching content. Well, as he's studying and as he's unpacking, he's like, there's so much here that we didn't see at first read. And we decided to deviate from the plan and let him preach 2 Sundays in a row so that he could cover everything that the Lord put on his heart. And if you heard those past 2 messages, you're like, yeah, it was a good thing that you guys made it, because the Lord really spoke some powerful messages in the things that Jake brought to light from Scripture. Had I preached this message before I had done that funeral, I would have taken a completely different approach. The funeral ended, and I really start unpacking what I'm going to talk about today. And it's funny because there's a lot that happens in Genesis chapter 25. So if you've got a Bible, go ahead and turn there. Otherwise, the words are going to be on the screens. But a lot happens, and a lot of transition happens. And so there's so much to cover that at first I was just going to glaze over the beginning and get to the new, more interesting parts, new characters to introduce. And then after that funeral experience, and I'm reading it, and the Lord just sort of convicted me, because I was like, I can't just glaze over the first 10 verses. Because Abraham dies in the first 10 verses of Genesis chapter 25. And I had planned originally just to kind of recap it, because truthfully, there's not a whole lot there. It's amazing. So many chapters covered this man's life, and he's mentioned so many more times. I believe it's over 80 times in the New Testament Abraham's mentioned, but then when his death comes, 10 verses. But I began reading into it and thinking, this is Abraham. This is a man of God that our church has been reading about for over 3 months straight now. This is a guy that God used to be the first generation of his chosen people, the Israelites. This is Abraham who believed in God's promise and was faithful, and then through that, God would usher in a bloodline that would bring the promised Messiah generations and generations later. It's through Abraham that we got Jesus to come to this earth and be born through Mary. And I was just going to glaze over it and move forward. But the Lord showed me, no, this is a moment to stop and look back and reflect all that God has taught us, shown us, and done. And so as I started unpacking and reading commentaries, this one guy that I was reading his commentary said the first 10 verses of chapter 25 are a lot like a eulogy and a reading of a will for this man named Abraham. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and unpack the first 10 verses of Genesis 25, and then we'll get to the rest on another week. It says, Abraham took another wife, whose name was Keturah. Now pause real quick. If you remember, Sarah had passed away. Sarah's original wife that we had learned so much about and seen God work through so much, she passed away. And if you remember, he went and bought a field, because it was a specific field, specific location, specific cave that he wanted her buried, paid a great amount for it. But it's because Abraham believed God so much that this is going to be the promised land that I showed you. He's like, I want Sarah to be buried there, because I'm looking forward to the promise that is yet to be fulfilled. In verse 2, she bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shurah. That's 6 more sons that Abraham had with another wife when he was well past 100 years old. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan. The sons of Dedan were Ashurim, Letushim, and Limam. Sorry if I butchered those, if anyone else is more educated in the room than I am. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, and Eldah. All these were children of Keturah. Abraham gave all he had to Isaac. But to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts. And while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. These are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with Sarah, his wife. And so remember, as we're reading this little bit, it's like this is a eulogy and a will reading. But there's so much more in just a few of these phrases that it designated us a moment to just pause before we move on into the book of Genesis and look back at everything that we've gathered so far. So like his first wife, Sarah, Abraham died in faith because for over 100 years now, they'd been a bit of a gypsy family. They'd been pilgrims on the earth seeking out this heavenly reward of a home and a country of a completely different kind than anyone had seen, and in a different kind than you and I might have a context for in our earthly mindset. This home, this country, it's one without borders. It's one without politics. It's one without enemies, or it's without time. Though he could have probably afforded some sprawling estate by then, and he's looking forward to an actual land that his family is going to settle in and populate and become this nation. He probably could have afforded all that, seen all that, but he moved around in caravans and he lived in tents for most of his life because his steps were directed by the Lord. He died in faith because most of God's promises to him had not actually come to full fruition yet, but he still believed God. Remember, that was one of the original markers of Abraham. He believed God, and God counted him as righteous. He lived this way because he was seeking God's best, not his own understanding of best. We often study a person in history. We read their biographies. If any of you guys are into biographies in the room, I admit that I've read just a handful, but we've got other pastors who read them way more than me. And they're fascinating, but what's interesting is there's always more to the story than what you read in one particular biography. You always look at the person and you're fascinated by them, look at what they accomplished, what they were known for, and they seem just like a hero. And so you read those and you say, well, how could I ever measure up to this guy that I just read about? The cool thing about the Bible and the way that Abraham's life was recorded was that it kept all the real stuff in there too. I'm talking about all the mistakes that Abraham made. They were in there too. Yet as Christians, we can still read about the life of Abraham and we think things like this. As a Christian, how could I possibly have that kind of faith? As a believer in Jesus Christ, how could I possibly follow in those footsteps? But the truth is that his life, Abraham's life, had not been easy. You and I, our lives are never always easy. Jesus doesn't promise that. But he walked in faith just one day at a time. And the Lord brought him through it all. And his faith was tested constantly. Let's just think about some of the scenarios that we've reflected on over the past 3+ months that Abraham found himself in, where he had faith, but his faith was tested. I mean, in the very beginning, God came to him. He wasn't even a God worshiper. He was a pagan worshiper with his dad. And God came and pursued him and said, hey, I'm calling you to a relationship with myself. But then he didn't stop there. He said, I'm going to call you out of this place to a new place that I have yet to describe and yet to tell you every step of the journey on the way, but I just need you to trust me. And then he says, I'm going to bless you, but I'm also going to use you to be a blessing to others. He says, go. And then fast forward, he says, oh, by the way, this is how this is going to play out. You're going to be the father of a great nation. You know, your descendants are going to outnumber the stars. Go outside, look at the stars, Abraham, count them. Okay, more than that. Now, you've been to the beach, right? Okay, imagine all the grains of sand, Abraham. Yeah, more than that. Your generations are going to be an unfathomable number to you, Abraham. But these are the plans that I have for you and the plans that I'm going to use you for to bring glory to my name. And then fast forward, he finally gets this son way after he and his wife are like normal childbearing age. And then the son becomes a teenager, and what happens? God tests his faith one more time, but not for the last time. He says, I want you to take your son, your only son, your beloved Isaac. I want you to take him up on that mountain and sacrifice him for me. Wait, what? My only son. Wait, this is the one that's part of the plan. How is this a part of the plan, God? How is this a good plan, God? But Abraham took steps, didn't he? He prepared things, and he marched his son all the way up to the top of that mountain, laid him down on a stone altar, and he raised the knife, and right before the knife dropped, God said, stop. I never meant for you to actually kill the boy. I simply wanted to test to see if I was still number one in your heart. I wanted to still see if you'd follow, if you'd take steps in your trustworthiness of me. And then Abraham looks over, and there in the bushes next to him is a ram whose thorns had become stuck in this bush. And God said, I've provided the sacrifice for you. Similarly, God uses that as a picture of the Messiah to come, where he sends Jesus to this earth. He says, you can't possibly make up for this division in our relationship from the sin that you've committed, but I have sent a substitutionary sacrifice to die in your place. My son Jesus is going to come, the Messiah. Now, this is the bloodline, Abraham's bloodline, the nation of Israel that God's going to send the Messiah to. That's one of the promises of how God's going to unfold history. Abraham's faith was tested day in and day out. So whenever Abraham had stumbled and failed the Lord, though, he returned to him and he started that faith journey all over again, and he believed God at his word all over again, and the Lord renewed his faith all over again, and he did it every single time. And every time he stumbled was an opportunity for God to prove his faithfulness to mankind. So in a way, Abraham is someone that we can glean these from, but really God is the hero of the story. And it's Abraham as a vessel to show us how God interacts with his people, those that he loves, those that he wants a relationship with. So Abraham realized time after time, God's still going to be here. No matter how many times I fail him, he's still going to show up. He's still going to be here. He's still going to be faithful. He's still going to love me. He's still going to be merciful. He's still going to be my God. And so Abraham, therefore, kept taking steps of obedience. He kept following after God's promises. God had even promised Abraham back in chapter 15 that he's like, Abraham, I know that your life has been far from peaceful, but I promise you're going to die in peace. And then look at what happens. Look at what unfolds in chapter 25. He died in a good old age, it says. A man full of years, and his family was gathered to him. God fulfilled that promise too. He died in peace. Abraham had walked in a way of righteousness with God. And so in turn, he had experienced peace with his relationship with God. Doesn't mean all of his circumstances and events that happened in his life were peaceful, but his relationship with God was peaceful because he walked in a way of righteousness with God. And God, who guided him and remained with him for over a century, he certainly wasn't going to forsake him in the end. He fulfilled the promise and gave Abraham this noble, peaceful death. You could tell his blessing was on Abraham. Abraham's now this living testimony for us, walking in faith, walking after this God who promises things to us and is who he says he is. Abraham was also an instrument, though. Remember, I'm going to bless you, but I'm going to use you to be a blessing to others. Ever stop to think that Abraham was a blessing to us here today, not just with his testimony, but all of his steps of obedience led to the Savior Jesus coming into this world to die for you and I. The death that we deserved. And in turn, we get a relationship with God that we didn't deserve. So his life of faith in God, the God that really is who he claims he is, the God that really does what he says he's going to do, this is the God that Abraham lived in surrender too. And Abraham lived a life of full surrender. He wasn't perfect. Things didn't go the way that he had planned them all the time. Scripture uses these words, he died in a good old age, an old man and full of years. It carries the idea that Abraham's life was good and full of God's goodness, full of God's blessing. And it was only good because God made it good, not because Abraham conjured any goodness or earned any goodness. God made it good because Abraham honored and obeyed. And Abraham honored, obeyed God because he had faith in who God was. And he knew God. He knew God's character is worth trusting, and so he kept taking these steps of faith that we saw all throughout most of Genesis that we've read so far. As we look back on everything we've learned about a man and his walk with the Lord, 4 things stick out. Now, these are very elementary, but if you're a note taker, you can take notes on these 4 things. These are the kind of things that are probably on, if they had gravestones in that day, these are the 4 things that are going to be on Abraham's gravestone. The first was this: Abraham had faith, which really means he believed God. You remember early on in his story, it didn't just say he believed in God, it says he believed God at his word, even when he couldn't see the full picture. My wife loves jigsaw puzzles. She also loves card games. I make fun of her all the time. I was born and raised in Tampa. She's from Michigan, the Great White North. I joke with her. And I make fun of her all the time. So I apologize if I'm about to offend a northerner in the room. I say, you have to like jigsaw puzzles and card games because y'all are basically snowed in half the year up there. You got to have something to do, right? But she's really good at jigsaw puzzles. I lose steam after a while. My eyes get tired. But she's started to impart that same love for puzzles to our kids. And so earlier this week, she found this like 500-piece, super complex jigsaw puzzle, and she just spreads it out with the box on like our breakfast counter. And she started a couple of pieces, but she wanted to get the boys involved in it, and she really wanted them to kind of take lead and just see how they did with a puzzle that was like, this is not a kid puzzle. And so morning after morning, our kids would come out, and they'd eat breakfast at this breakfast counter, and just slowly chip away at piecing together this puzzle. She'd send me little picture updates as I was at work here, and then a few days into it, she sends me a picture one morning. They'd finished it. And I was like, did you help? She's like, no, they did it. They just took their time day after day, and they finished it. I was so proud. I was so impressed. You know what's more impressive, though? You ever seen those people that can do a puzzle flipped over? You know, like where all you see is that grayish brown cardboard on every single piece? There are people out there who can finish a puzzle that way. And then they can put some glue or whatever and then flip the thing over and boom, there's the completed picture. What's interesting though is I can just imagine being in the room while one of those puzzles are being completed. You know, we always put the box up as like an easel for reference. When you're doing a puzzle that way, the box doesn't even matter because you can't even see the picture unfolding in front of you. You're just doing one piece at a time. I'm convinced the reason those people are actually successful in doing it that way is because they're not focused on the whole picture. They're focused on one piece at a time. And over time, as they do that and they chip away at it, they start to pick up on these subtle little themes and patterns in just a piece of a puzzle that fits into another piece. And then they start to see how it all works together. I'm convinced that walking in faith with the Lord looks a little bit more like this, where we focus on just one small piece at a time. Not being able to see the whole picture, and even seeing the whole picture won't do us any good because we don't even know how it's unfolding out in front of us. But we just faithfully, like those people, meticulously pick up on these subtle themes and these subtle little commonalities and these subtle little rhythms and patterns of God's character. And through that, we learn to just trust that as He guides and directs our steps, one piece of our life after another, one piece of our story after another, we know that in the end, because he's a God that is who he says he is. We know that in the end, when we see that full picture, it's going to be a work of art because of what he's done. The other thing that we pick up from Abraham, not just that he had faith, that he didn't have to see the whole picture ahead of time, but he also just flat out obeyed God. Now this is major. Simple but major. He took steps, not knowing how he would arrive at the final destination. If you remember back the original call of Abraham, God didn't give him the roadmap. But he obeyed, he took steps. My wife and I spent 5 years living in the state of North Carolina. We have some friends that we still keep in touch with. They're like lifelong friends. And we go visit them sometimes. They come and visit us sometimes. And they've got 2 kids that are slightly older than our kids. And so it's been fun watching their kids grow up, but also grow up just ahead of ours so that we kind of see what we're in store for like in the next 4 or 5 years. And their kids are amazing. They're godly kids. Like they're going to be leaders in the faith when they graduate high school. They're super flexible too. Like it's crazy that this family, years ago, they bought this rundown, tiny little farmhouse on this big plot of land in North Carolina. The husband, my buddy, is a firefighter, and so after he'd finish his shift, he would go and he'd just knock out one little task. 6, 7 months later, they're finally moving into that house. It was small, quaint, but beautiful because of the restoration that had happened. There's wild berry bushes all over the property. I mean, just picture being a kid raised on that land. It was cool, and they're like living their best life for a little while, but then they get itchy again. And they decide, the market's really great right now. Let's sell it. They sold it for like more than double what they bought it for. And they did what every other young family with young kids does when they sell their house. They bought a camper. And they're traveling around in a camper. And their kids are like being homeschooled in a camper for a couple of years. And they're like, oh, let's go to the Outer Banks of North Carolina and let's do homeschool on the beach for a month. And let's go down to Kyle and Bree. They live in Florida. Let's go check that out. And you know, it's like their kids became so flexible. Now what they've done was picture like Mayberry, North Carolina, the Andy Griffith Show. That quaint little North Carolina small town with a tiny little downtown area. They're like, it'd be cool to live like right near there. And so they were patient, and they found this tiny little house. But it's this tiny little quaint downtown house. They can walk to the little restaurants and shops and all that kind of stuff. And meanwhile, their kids are just loving every minute of life that way. And I'm like, it's crazy how flexible those kids are. They're go with the flow. But I've known their kids for a long time. And their kids have not always been like that. Because they were just normal kids before, with all the same amount of questions and struggles and things that they're learning, and they learn to be like that from all the experience that their parents allowed them to go through. But you know what? You know what I remember from when we lived in the same state as their kids? Their parents would tell us, we have this phrase that we say way too much in our household. And this phrase goes something like this: just get in the car. Okay, we're going somewhere. Where are we going? Just get in the car. Okay, we're going to go and when are we going to be back? Just get in the car. Can I take a snack? Are we going to have snacks there? When will we be home? Who are we going to go visit? Just get in the car. And their parents are like, this is starting to get comical. It's almost, but at the same time, we've learned so much about our walk in faith with God. As parents of these children who are constantly asking questions and we're constantly saying, just get in the car. Where we're like, God, but, and he's like, just get in the car. God, but where are we going to, just get in the car. But when will we be, just get in the car. But who's going to be, just get in the car. And God asks us sometimes to obey. Sometimes he asks us to take steps in our walk with him in situations in our life. Sometimes it's things that we need to leave behind. Sometimes it's better things that he's leading us to. And we have a million questions. We have a million fears. We want to be involved in every step of the process, and his answer sometimes is, hey, just get in the car. Because you know wherever I'm going to take you is going to be good, right? I'm your dad. You know that I'm going to be with you along this journey, right? Just get in the car. Abraham obeyed God. And every step of the way, he might have struggled. He saw some things that struck the fear of God into his heart. He experienced some pain that to most people they would have turned and gone back home. He experienced struggle and hardship that would have made him want to just stop right there in his tracks. But for some reason or another, he believed God so much that he just obeyed and he kept going. The other thing that Abraham did that was probably on his headstone was this, is Abraham persevered. This is a word that we see pop up in the New Testament from time to time, and a lot of times it's actually linked to persecution. See, in the New Testament, a lot of those New Testament writers, they're writing in a culture where Christianity was not popular. Christianity was downright dangerous. And talks about persevering in your faith for when times get tough, for when things aren't going your way, for when your views, your beliefs, your lifestyle as a believer in Jesus Christ isn't popular, for when you have very few people that are walking that walk next to you. Persevere. There's another level of perseverance that Abraham showed me that I want to point out to you today, though, is this. How many times did Abraham mess up? I mean, flat out fail. How many times did we see his sin just written out in the book of Genesis for generations to see? Sometimes the hardest thing in persevering in our faith is not when things are hard around us, although that is. And it's not just when persecution is happening around us, though it's easy to want to give up because you're just tired of the pain and the frustration and the backlash that you're getting. But sometimes perseverance looks more like getting back up after you've stumbled in your walk. Getting back up and running to the Father even when you've sinned the biggest sin that you've ever could have imagined and that you would ever commit. And Abraham modeled one thing for us. He still, after those moments, he still returned to the Lord, trusting that God was still going to want to walk with him, trusting that God was still going to fulfill his promises, trusting that God was going to say, yeah, you're still mine. That's the God that served and loved and led Abraham. And it's the same God for us today. And so if there's one thing that we glean from Abraham's perseverance is sometimes perseverance looks like when we feel like we have let God down in the greatest way ever. Notice a lot of the interactions we see with Abraham and God in Scripture, it's a conversation between him and the Lord. But don't forget that not too long after Abraham left his hometown, left his father, all that kind of stuff, he started to amass this big traveling village caravan. Everywhere he went, he was blessed with people that would become his people. And don't forget, he's the patriarch of the group. In a way, he was the first prophet, the person that would speak between God and man to his people. And whenever he messed up in his own walk with God, he probably felt, I didn't just fail God, I failed all of these people that are looking to me as an example. But Abraham persevered in his walk with God. No matter how many times he stumbled, he still got up and he took steps forward. Last thing that we can glean from him is that, and you notice it in the first 10 verses that we read in Genesis chapter 25, is that Abraham set up the next generation for success. He was thinking forward into God's promises yet to be fulfilled. He was thinking, how can I hand down being God's people to the next generation in my bloodline with my people? Notice how he set Isaac apart, it says, giving him the full inheritance. Yes, he gave gifts, he gave blessings to the other kids he had through concubines, all that kind of stuff, but he sent them away from Isaac, giving Isaac everything, because the others were not a part of God's promise through him and Sarah. Isaac was it. It was all he was banking God's promise on because he was the promised one. Abraham could have easily slipped back into his wavering faith days. Well, I had the second wife over here after Sarah passed away. And she gave me 6 more sons. They've all got my last name. So they're an insurance policy in case Isaac passes away early and is not able to carry on. No, he didn't do that. He banked everything on God's promise and says, Isaac is the one. And in doing this, Abraham continued that faith legacy, handing it down. And in his very last days, he set up the next generation to still trust, believe, follow this God and the promises yet to be fulfilled. Abraham passed down an attitude of faith. He took steps ensuring that the next generation would follow after God as well. So the challenge that I want to give all of us today is that oftentimes in our Christian life, we use multiple terminologies. Terminologies like, I follow Jesus, or would you like to follow Jesus? Or sometimes we say stuff about my walk with God. And what we really mean is our faith, our walk with God. But the proof is in our steps. And our faith is only faith if it's in motion. Because whenever God spoke, Abraham moved. Abraham prepared. Abraham took action. Abraham obeyed, exercised faith, persevered, set up the next generation. So do you trust that God is worth following? Do you trust that wherever he's leading is better than what he's calling you to leave? Are you taking steps to trust God more? Are you moving toward Christ, or are you standing still? Hebrews chapter 11 also kind of parallels the life of Abraham and Sarah, and we use this as a lot of commentary for the chapters of Genesis that we've read so far, and I think it's appropriate today that we reread part of chapter 11 as we kind of put a bow on Abraham's life. Let's pick up in verse 8 of Hebrews 11. It says, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, was born descendants as many as the stars of heaven and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they're seeking a homeland. If they'd been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country. That is, a heavenly one. Don't miss that. And therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he's prepared for them a city. Think about what people would say at my funeral, what would end up on my tombstone. I'd want them to say that my life was a life of obedience to God. I'd want them to say that every step that I took and every place that I went were only because God had directed them. You and I have the opportunity to think ahead, because one day we're all going to suffer the same fate that Abraham suffered. We're going to die a physical death. There's going to be a funeral. People are going to talk about us. We're going to leave some sort of legacy somewhere. Abraham was just a precursor to the coming Messiah that God was dialing up through Abraham's people. And Abraham wasn't the perfect messenger of God. We've gotten that message loud and clear. But the perfect messenger that God would ultimately send would be through Abraham's bloodline because of Abraham's obedience and faith. This is the nation of Israel. And God would send his only son, his perfect messenger, his perfect mediator between man and God, Jesus, to not only show his people how to fully trust, to fully obey, to fully live for, but Jesus would also die for us in order to save us from our sin, this predicament that we found ourselves in that's caused separation between us and God. Jesus came to build that bridge back, but he was the only way. Because there's no way that any of us could do anything to make up for all the sin that we've committed. Even one thing, if you've ever done one thing, the Bible says it has to be a substitutionary sacrifice. Remember the ram stuck in the thicket before Isaac was killed. Jesus came to earth to die in our place because there's no way that we're making things right with God on our own. We need the perfect one to do it for us. So here enters Jesus, generations and generations after Abraham passed away, the promised Messiah, through his people, to die for his people. He's the only one who is perfectly obedient to the Father to the point of death on a cross. And Jesus told us, follow me. You remember one of the first accounts of Jesus when he's really doing ministry as a young adult in the Gospels. He walks up to just a couple of guys running the family fishing business on a lakeshore, and he says, hey, drop your nets. Follow me. You're not going to fish for fish anymore. I'm going to help you fish for people. Jesus is saying, follow me. Will you follow me? A few years ago, we lived in the state of Pennsylvania. Looks a little bit different than Florida. We lived in Pittsburgh, and a lot of people think of Pittsburgh as this like leveled, flat, gray, smoggy, dirty, industrial city on the bank of a river. But actually, Pittsburgh was beautiful. And because the city was kind of hilly and mountainy and pockets of green all over the place, it was almost like the wilderness was taking back over the city. But it also meant that no matter where you were, you could drive about 15 minutes and be in the woods, see a waterfall, find a short little hiking trail. It's still close to the city, but because of the way the city was laid out, you felt like you were in the middle of nowhere. And so oftentimes, because, winter had lasted so long and the kids were like tired of being cooped up indoors, spring hits. This is before my youngest son was even born. I get the two older boys ready to go on a hike, just them and Dad. And so I'm out on this hike that I had discovered before. It's this amazing, cool area that you sort of hike down, and then it levels off for a little bit, and then you hike a little bit back up, and there's this amazing stream that's running along, and there's a waterfall. Behind the waterfall is a cave. And I wanted to show him. But because it was springtime in Pennsylvania, it rained so much there. And it rained so much that week that we get all the way down there, and it starts getting a little bit more treacherous. And we get all the way down, all of a sudden we realize the trails had been completely washed out. But the rangers had just not been able to put up signs saying, oh, this trail is closed. But we're already in the middle of it. There's only one way in or one way out, but it's not staying put. And so it gets worse as we're trying to get through all this muddied, washed out trail. And my two little boys are there, and they've got their little hiking boots on. And then at one point, I just hear, Dad, and I look back, and one of them had just sunk into like 6 inches of mud and then went, and their shoe is in the mud. And my youngest, at the time he was my youngest, is just kind of flamingoing it right there. I don't know what to do. And so I'm like trudging back through the mud, and I slip and fall in the mud, and they're laughing at me, and he's still balancing on one foot, and I'm digging the shoe out of the mud, and I'm just getting all the extra mud off of this thing, and I'm just done. I'm just done at this point. Get his shoe back on. All right. Guys, we got to keep going, okay? All right, and then, as if things couldn't get a little bit more tricky, something else happened. I smelled a smell in the woods. This is the kind of smell that you smell when you're driving through the Carolinas, through North Georgia, maybe on your way up, and you smell something pretty bad on the side of the road. It's a skunk. But this isn't a dead stationary skunk on the side of the road that you know exactly where it is and how to avoid it. This is a skunk on the loose in the wild. My pupils start dilating. I start having PTSD because about 2 years before that, when we were living in North Carolina, I had a dog that we'd let out the back porch, and there's some like woods behind our house, and we just let him out, go to the bathroom. It's 11 o'clock at night. No one's out there. And then 10 minutes later, we call him back, and he always comes back because that's where the food is. Well, this one night I go out there, and he's like taking an extra long time, you know, just gallivanting, living his best life as a little dog. Calling him, and I'm like, God, man, something smells like a chemical fire out here. What is that? There's something burning out there. It's like, wow, that's weird. And then it finally runs right into the kitchen. So I know you know where it's going. I walk back inside, I close the door, I'm like, that smell, so strong. Then I look down at him, and he's staring up at me, and he's like doing this a lot, and his eyes are just bloodshot, tearing up, and it just, ding, my dog just got skunked. That smell that I smelled, that was a skunk. And that smell is now in my house, and I'm freaking out. And so that was one of the worst nights of my life. I was almost ready to just take the dog out into the woods and like find a way to leave him there, but I was a good owner, and I'm telling you, the process of getting that smell out of a dog, it's a process. So 2 years later, I'm on this hike, and I smell that smell. Pupils dilate, PTSD kicks in. We gotta go. Guys, we gotta go. We gotta get out of here, guys. I'm like scared, and they're like, is it a bear? I'm like, oh, it's worse than a bear. It's a skunk, you know? And so I'm like trying not to scare them too much, but I'm walking along making noise. Woo, like hiking along. Like, Dad, what's the matter with them? I'm trying to scare the skunk away, like announce yourself. They're going to be scared of you, right? And we're slipping and sliding. I'm smelling the smell, and I'm just like, I finally turn around, and I get down on their level, and I say, hey, boys, we got to get out of here right now. We can't keep doing what we've been doing. It's not working for us. You're both too heavy for me to carry out of here because I'm going to have such a high center of weight gravity. I'm just going to slip, and we're all going to fall. So here's what we're going to do, guys. I'm going to take smaller steps, and you're going to step right where I step every bit of the way, because where I step is going to be safe for you to step. Jesus Christ sent his only son, Jesus, to this earth to say, hey, we're in a pretty bad predicament here, but I am the only way to safety with the Father. But hey, I need you to listen to me. I need you to do what I say. And I need you to step only where I step. And if you do that, it's the way to safety with the Father. Abraham lived a life as a precursor to what it looks like to follow after Jesus as the church today. So our job as the church is to listen to him. Hang on every word he says. Do exactly what he says. And step only where he steps, following him, because he's the way to safety with the Father. There are a lot of different people from a lot of different walks of life, stages in life in the room right now. We'd be here all day if we tried to parse out applications to everybody. But my closing challenge is this, before the band comes up, it's this. If we are standing still, we are not walking in faith. And here's what that might look like for somebody in the room today. Is that obedience and faith means movement. It means taking steps to follow after and obey Jesus. Sometimes it looks like, am I doing anything to glorify God more in my marriage? Am I taking steps to make my marriage more Christ-honoring? Or what about these kids that the Lord gave us? Am I taking steps to ensure that the next generation that the Lord's given me are going to also follow after and believe in his promises? Am I taking steps with them? If you own your own business, if you're an employee somewhere, and things aren't always perfect around you, are we taking steps to be obedient and to give God honor and glory in the realms of influence that he's given us on this earth? Maybe it's with your extended family or your neighbors, the people that really make you wonder sometimes, am I actually saved? Because I'm feeling some pretty hateful things right now, They test your salvation. Are you taking steps in those relationships to be more like Christ to them, or more like your old self before you knew Christ? Because obedience means movement. We can't just stand still in our faith. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for the testimony that you've given us in Abraham and his life. God, I know it's really easy for us to be challenged, but also be overwhelmed at the fact that we'll feel like we'll never have that kind of faith. Help us to remember that, Lord, you allowed all those things to happen to him in order to show us more of yourself, so that we would know you, know your character, know all the subtleties of who you are, and trust you with the big picture of our life and with our future. So God, help us focus on just the small steps today. Help us just to focus on the next piece that you've got in front of us, trusting you with the rest. Help us to believe you. Not just believe in you, but to believe you at your word and live like it. God, we need your help doing this, but we want to. So God, we need your inspiration, we need your power, we need your spirit to guide us, we need your grace for when we mess up. But we know, Lord, that we want to be someone known as someone who is full of faith in you, marked by obedience to you, someone who perseveres in our own failures and in our own disappointments around us, and someone who's passing it on to the next generation of believers. So God, help us believe in your promises and live like we do. Amen.